Defence Dialogue, a podcast discussing contemporary challenges in the area of European security and defence. Brought to you by the Martin Centre with Nicholas Novacki.
Welcome everybody to another episode of the Wilfried Martin Centre for European Studies Defence Dialogue podcast series. It's been a while since the last episode, but quite a lot has happened since. My name is Dr. Nicholas Novacki, and with me here today, like usually, is my very good colleague and friend Alvaro de la Cruz from the Martin Centre's communication team. Alvaro, good to have you here today as well.
Thank you, Nicholas. Good morning, everyone. It is the ninth day of the invasion today, and it seems weird, but I guess many more to come.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, the big topic now that everybody is talking in the field of security and defense is the Russian all-out war against Ukraine, which Alvaro alluded to already. And this war began last week on the 24th of February. Came after months or weeks of speculation, really, of like what Russia was hoping to achieve with its massive military buildup along its border with Ukraine. But now, finally, after weeks of lies and disinformation, the masks have finally come off. War has shown its ugly face, and people are dying as a result. And I think Europe and the world must really do everything that they can to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people in their time of need in this very dark time. And Europe, I think, was hoping until the very end, until the morning of February 24th, in which all of us learned about the war that had started in Ukraine, that war could be avoided, and that Putin's aim with the military buildup along Ukraine's border was mainly diplomatic, that he would seek to use it mainly as a diplomatic leverage, as he had done before. Russia temporarily increased its forces by the Ukrainian border also in spring of last year, in 2021, it's good to remember, and gained a bilateral summit between President Putin and President Biden by doing so. So I think there were kind of expectation that like this would be another attempt to extort diplomatic concessions from Europe and the West. And I think kind of most leaders and experts, like in the run up to the 24th of February, really didn't quite think that Russia would actually like launch a massive all-out war in Ukraine. But alas, that is where we are at the moment. And in the run up to the war, both Europe and the US also like tried to like deter Russia from taking any sort of like aggressive measures against Ukraine by announcing that they would pass massive sanctions. I mean, if the war would begin. But the shock of Russia's decision to go to war has caused quite a big change in Europe's strategic culture, and this change has been both massive and sudden. The EU has agreed unprecedented sanctions and other restrictive measures against Russia, such as suspending the broadcasting activities like within the EU's own territory of Sputnik and Russia Today, Russian state-controlled media companies, and also banning 7 Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment system. Germany has also announced that it will increase its defense spending massively, and that it will make a constitutional commitment to NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending target, which is also a massive change. And then many European countries are providing bilateral lethal military aid to Ukraine, providing arms, providing artillery pieces, etc., which has also been a big sudden change. But then perhaps kind of for the European Union, the biggest change has been the EU's decision to provide a 450 million lethal arms support package to Ukraine through the European Peace Facility. And this is for the first time in the Union's history that the EU has approved the supply of lethal weapons to a third country that is fighting a war, and then really massive cultural change. And we have to kind of remember that for a long time, I mean, there were kind of even since the EU defense cooperation began, like there were discussions and arguments about whether the European Union like was really a civilian power, like rather than a kind of traditional one able to use military force or able to act geopolitically. But I think kind of this decision kind of is really quite groundbreaking and shows that when the EU talks about that its desire to speak the language of power and to act geopolitically, I mean it can do so. And so the entire underlying culture that has supported the development of EU defense cooperation, like for the past decades, like has changed. I already mentioned that it has shown that the EU can speak the language of power and act geopolitically, not just in the field of economics and geoeconomics, but also in the field of security and defense. And I think this is very good news. I mean, if there's a silver lining, like in any of this, I mean, it's very good news for all those EU countries, like who have called for the EU to take further steps towards becoming a genuine defense union. And this European Peace Facility, lethal aid decision in particular, I think increases also indirectly the credibility of the EU's own mutual aid and assistance commitments, like such as the credibility of Article 42.7 of the Treaty of the European Union, which mentions that if one EU member state becomes subject to armed aggression on its territory, like then all the other member states like shall have an obligation towards it to provide all the aid and assistance that they can to help it. And I think this decision to provide lethal aid and assistance to Ukraine, like also strengthens indirectly this mutual assistance commitment or its credibility. And also, I mean, it will make the EU, it will increase the EU's attractiveness as a security and defense partner to other countries as well, like not just Ukraine, but when they see that the EU is able to kind of muster this sort of political will to provide, not just to agree on sanctions, but to also provide military equipment and capabilities to a country fighting a war. I mean, it will also increase the EU's attractiveness to countries, for example, in the Indo-Pacific, which I think is very positive too. So I think just finally, like given everything that's going on, I don't think the EU should really rush to adopt some of these ongoing plans that have been kind of now quite dramatically affected by the war in Ukraine. And I'm thinking especially of the forthcoming strategic compass, which the EU is meant to adopt this month in March. And then also afterwards, after it has been adopted by the Council of the EU, by the ministers, it is also meant to be endorsed by heads of state and government in the European Council. And according to the original timeline, like there's going to be a Foreign Affairs Council towards the end of the month, in which it will be adopted and then endorsed afterwards by the European Council. But there's already been kind of a couple of drafts of the strategic compass, I mean, which were developed before the war and before the really even kind of before tensions between the European Union and Russia like peaked at the beginning of the year. So I think kind of given everything that has changed, given like the massive cultural changes also in the field of European defense cooperation, like it would be good to not rush with the finalization of the strategic compass and take the proper time to revise it and to make sure that, I mean, it reflects the current realities and does not seem outdated the moment that it is adopted. I think many of the ongoing kind of the remaining disputes that have kind of characterized the strategic compass process, such as, I mean, what to do with Article 44 of the Treaty on the European Union, which would basically make it possible for certain groups of EU member states to launch coalitions of the willing in crisis management operations. So even if not all countries would participate, that means some countries could launch these sort of coalitions of the willing. But disagreements over these sorts of instruments like seem rather trivial at the moment, and I think kind of there needs to kind of be more. It really needs to be kind of revised quite strongly, the document, before it's adopted. If it isn't a kind of sufficiently like revised in the coming weeks, and if there isn't sufficient time, I mean, then like I mentioned, it will be outdated probably. I mean, the moment it will be adopted, and then it will also increase like the relevance of NATO's own strategic concept. I mean, there's been kind of some. I mean, since NATO began to draft its own strategic concept, I mean, the strategic compass process has become like a little bit overshadowed by that anyway, because that is kind of where most EU member states, NATO is where most EU member states like do their security and defense policy anyway, and the strategic compass process is being kind of allocated to this secondary slot. But kind of for the moment, it looks like most EU countries like want to follow the current, the previously agreed timeline when it comes to adopting and finalizing the strategic compass. So meaning that it would still be adopted in March, but we'll see. Like things can change very quickly, as we've seen in the past kind of few days, and if it is adopted, I do hope that, I mean, it has been revised sufficiently to reflect these new realities that we are facing. That's it.
Okay, so indeed we see how much the invasion of Ukraine has changed Europe's strategic culture, but let's develop a little bit on both the European Union's strategic compass and NATO's strategic concept. NATO's strategic concept, the current one, is around 12 years old, if I'm not mistaken, and it even describes something like the pursuit of a true strategic partnership between NATO and Russia. So it's not only old, it's completely outdated by many circumstances, and even the draft of the strategic compass, the European strategic compass, was drafted before not only the invasion, but also the Russian private security group Wagner acting in Africa against France. So my first question would be: is there still time to update the strategic compass sufficiently? Is the NATO strategic concept the only hope? And also, do we take serious consideration also to other fronts such as Sahel and in Africa, as not only terrorist groups, but also Russia is approaching that front, and that would potentially affect much more Southern European countries? What do you think, Nicholas?
I mean, with the timeline, like I said, I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean, there's not a lot of time left at the moment to revise the document, and it's not kind of totally easy also to say kind of beyond the threat analysis section. I mean, how should the war kind of affect the compass? I think the sections on the EU's own kind of resilience and the relevance of instruments such as Article 42.7, the mutual assistance clause, I mean, would certainly have to be strengthened. There would have to be kind of stronger language on like a great clearer proposals on how these mutual assistance like clauses could be used in a crisis, and what sort of aid and assistance member states like could potentially receive like through it. And that's one. And perhaps also like then on how additional proposals on what the European Union can do to support like kind of partners like fighting wars through the various instruments that it has. In the Sahel, I mean, yeah, I mean, this is something that, I mean, the EU has been kind of now discussing for quite some time, like the increased presence of the Wagner group in places such as the Central African Republic and Mali, and it has made the operating environments of the EU's own security and defense policy missions and operations, like in those countries, quite a bit more complicated than they have been before. And in fact, many of these missions, I mean, have become the target of disinformation operations and like that and cyber attacks that people say are orchestrated by Russia as well. So the compass or the drafts, I mean, they also talk about increasing the resilience and of the EU CSDP missions and operations towards various types of disinformation and cyber attacks. And I think this is one way to kind of address it. But then, of course, I mean, it's a much more geopolitical question when you ask, I mean, how the EU can kind of, what can it and what should it do to mitigate the increased influence of actors such as China and Russia in Africa, and that's a much more complicated question.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. Well, on the other hand, we've seen both Sweden and Finland changing a historical defense approach, even Switzerland and Ireland when it comes to their neutrality in actions such as the sanctions change as well. Germany and now Italy announcing that they will reach or even overpass the 2% GDP investment in defense. For some, more has been done for the European defense and security in a week than in the precedent 33 years. But my concern is, how long do you think this is sustainable? For how long citizens and governments will be willing to not only invest this much money, but effort and capabilities and sustain the economical also loses that it implies for Europe? Do you think this is something that has come for good to stay?
It's too early to say. I mean, it depends on several factors. I mean, it depends on how long the war in Ukraine will go on, and I mean, and what sort of spillover effects I mean it will have towards to Europe and the European Union. I mean, if it becomes like a prolonged conflict, such as the war in, that we had in Afghanistan for years, if the spillover effects remain limited, then at some point in time there will be a moment in which people will start to lose interest, and the thing kind of will become normalized as the Ukraine kind of conflict, the conflict in the Donbass and the Donetsk region since 2014, I mean, became. I mean, let's not forget that, I mean, Ukraine has been fighting a war, I mean, or has been a country in war since 2014. And at some point in time, when conflicts become prolonged, I mean, they get stuck. Other things happen, and people lose interest, and then all those people who now in social media kind of have put Ukrainian flags into their profile pictures, I mean, will start to kind of look into other things. That's one danger. I think it's important to kind of keep it on the agenda of the European Union and the West now. But the good thing is that, I mean, what we've seen in the past week or so, I mean, has been kind of rather dramatic, and the changes have been quite big. Then it's electoral question as well to some extent. I mean, when elections start to happen, and whether these sorts of whether they're stronger European defense policy or stronger increased defense budgets, will be something that European voters will vote for, even if there is an ongoing war against that Russia is fighting against Ukraine, is something that remains to be seen. But this does really require then kind of political leadership and courage from the political class to then make a point, explain clearly why it is in the interest of their voters to support increased defense budgets.
Yeah, no, it's certainly it's yet to be seen for how long we are willing to invest that much. There's of course cases and examples of countries that actually are not doing well economically in a sustained long time, like Greece, that still invest a big part of their GDPs. But I have trouble seeing countries like mine, Spain or Portugal, having lots of debt and unemployment. Although some say that the military industry can create a lot of jobs, I have my doubts that they will be willing to sustain a long time effort in this sense. On the other hand, some sources say that Russia has, in just these first few days of invasion, lost as many troops as they did in 8 years in Syria, and that if the current trend sustain, they will lose more in 2 weeks than they did in over a decade in Afghanistan. I know that rationality is not behind Putin's mind usually, but do you think they're willing to sacrifice whatever it takes to achieve this invasion?
Well, I mean, he said yesterday that I mean they will do whatever needs to be done to kind of finish the war. And like over the past couple of days, I mean, we've seen that the tactics have become more brutal. There have been kind of more missile strikes, more civilian targets have been hit. There've been kind of more casualties. But with regards to the Russian casualties, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't think kind of we can verify them like in any credible way yet. We also kind of don't, like Ukraine hasn't like also kind of said anything about like its own casualties yet, as far as I know. But like Russia is a country that has a very high tolerance for pain, like if history like can teach us anything, and that is kind of that is a concerning fact. That's like when Putin says that, I mean he's ready to do kind of whatever it takes. I mean you have to kind of take him by his word and kind of accept and plan, or at least kind of plan for the eventuality that he's serious, like when he says that. And we have to kind of therefore like do what we can to support the Ukrainians kind of fighting against Russia in Ukraine at the moment. And because like the more time goes on, the more difficult it will become then for them to resist and to fight back, simply because the military balance is so overwhelmingly in Russia's favor in terms of manpower, in terms of capabilities. It's very difficult.
Yeah, well, not sure about manpower. Maybe for sure for professional soldiers now, the number of Ukrainian citizens willing to fight is 10-1 in favor of Ukraine. But of course, if we don't provide them with the military equipment needed, it's going to be impossible for them to resist much longer.
Yeah, I mean that's it. I mean it's difficult to kind of, if it becomes kind of a Afghanistan type situation in which like Russia, like I mean let's hope it does not happen. But I mean if they kind of gain military control of the entire country, and or even if they gain kind of military control of parts of the country, if the civilian population like resists, like and kind of sets up an insurgency kind of against the invaders, I mean it becomes like rather difficult to control it, to control the territory, and I think the Russians know this. So what the Ukrainians also, of course, going to have on their side is that, like, I mean, they know the country, and like they know it better. They know the environment better than the Russians, and they can use it in their advantage, like when they are fighting the Russian invaders.
Yeah, one of the most successful or strongest instruments we have to help them right now is the European Peace Facility, but this is an off-budget instrument that has a ceiling. If I'm not mistaken, we already used 500 million, which is close to the ceiling for this year spending. I think it's around 5.6 billion euros for 6 years spending. Is there a possibility to adapt and overfund this instrument? Do you know if there's a possibility for us to adapt, change, and overpass these ceilings pre-established?
Yeah, I mean, if they want, if the member states, I mean, want to kind of increase it like significantly, I mean, then of course they can do it because it's an off-budget instrument. And I don't remember now exactly kind of, I mean, what the procedure of kind of increasing of it. of its budget is. But member states like contribute to the European Peace Facility like in accordance with their gross national income. So that means that like Germany is the largest contributor, and then whatever country like has the smallest GDP, gross national income, contributes the least. And the kind of 7-year budget for the EPF was agreed like in the framework of the MFF negotiations, when they finished last year. No, 2020 they finished. And yeah, we'll see. I mean, now the 500 million that has been kind of agreed for Ukraine, like, is more or less kind of what it can dispense in 1 year. So I mean, depending on like how long the conflict will last, and depending on like how much what the political willingness to provide arms to Ukraine like via it is, I mean, it may of course kind of be possible then to or it may become necessary to increase the budget amount of the European Peace Facility. But yeah, I mean, it's another very interesting change that like this instrument is used to now provide lethal aid and assistance to Ukraine, because it used to be the old Athena mechanism, or actually, I mean, it's a combination of the old Athena mechanism and the African Peace Facility. And the Athena mechanism is basically an instrument that was used to finance the common cost of EU military crisis management operations. And now that like this thing has kind of morphed into an instrument that the EU can use to kind of provide military aid and equipment to a country fighting a war is quite extraordinary.
I have a last question, Nicholas. We're talking about the strengthening of the European strategic autonomy and defense. What about the United States? Is this invasion a change of paradigm in the current trend for American foreign policy? Are they going to pay some attention to Europe again, or they will remain focused on the Pacific?
No, I don't think it's going to be a paradigm change. I mean, it's like there does seem to. I mean, the Americans have wanted like since the Obama times to kind of refocus on the Indo-Pacific, because I mean, like their main like concern is still China and what is happening in the Indo-Pacific. And Russia has shown that, I mean, it has this kind of ability to kind of pull back the Americans to Europe, as it did in 2014, and as it is kind of doing now again. I mean, the Americans are now concerned, of course, and like focused on like what is happening in Europe. The role of NATO will increase, and the importance of NATO will also kind of increase in the eyes of the Americans, because I mean, it becomes again kind of more apparent to them, I mean, why organizations such as NATO are necessary in the first place, and also that like Russia can act aggressively, and that it has intentions to use military force to advance its aims. But I mean, whether I don't kind of, the Americans will now kind of remain focused, at least in the short term, in Europe. But I mean, I think their kind of core foreign policy is still that, I mean, they would want Europe to do more for their own defense, and eventually kind of keep a closer eye then on the Indo-Pacific. But yeah, I mean, the Americans kind of tend to get pulled back into Europe, I mean, whenever something like this happens. So I think kind of now that there is a moment in time in which the Americans are again kind of focused in Europe, and that they are focused on NATO, it's necessary to do what we can also to kind of ensure that NATO is up to date, and that it is able to meet the kind of various threats and challenges that it can face. And it's good that the strategic concept process is going on at the moment, and that NATO will adopt a new strategic concept then I think this summer in the Madrid summit. So I mean, we have to use this moment to that the Americans are giving us to focus in Europe.
Well, let's hope and pray that the Ukrainians will persist, that we will meet the expectations and the historical moment requires. And thank you very much for a very interesting insight on the situation, Nicholas.
Thanks a lot. And thanks to everybody for listening.
That was today's episode of Defence Dialogue. Subscribe to our podcasts for more.